Welcome back. Now it's time to actually create the functions that we'll be using when we run the larger piece of code at the end that actually plays the game. And there's a lot of flexibility having these functions, so don't take the instructions here as the only correct way to do this. We're going to start off by creating a function called takeBet that is going to ask the user for a bet and then set that as the actual bet. So let's do the following here. We'll say takeBet and we'll pass in some chips, and then we will say while true, we're going to try the following. We'll say chips.bet is equal to the integer of the input. How many chips would you like to bet? Question mark, space. And then we'll say except, so if they didn't actually input an integer, maybe they put in a letter, we'll say print, sorry, please provide an integer. Then we can say else if chips.bet is greater than the total number of chips available in this object. You'll say print, sorry, you do not have enough chips. You have, and then we can insert how much they have. So we'll say dot format chips, total number of chips there. Else, we're going to break out of this while loop. So this is just one way we could have done this. You didn't actually have to pass in the chips here. There's an example in the notebook, which I'm going to drag over real quick, just so we can see it. Here we can see that there's another method you could have done this that would not have taken in the chips object. Instead, if you knew in advance that you were going to call a particular player's chips object, you could have just called player chips here.bet. So it's really up to you, depending on how you can call this function, whether you want to pass in any arguments or not. Usually, when you're calling a function, you're going to want to pass in arguments. That way, you can have control of the global variables without needing to call that global keyword. Again, it's really up to you, whichever version you prefer. So we'll go with the version that we have where we're actually asking for the chips. So let's break this down, what we just did. We take in some chips. Remember, that's the class we just said here, and it has a total and a bet attribute. We set the bet equal to whatever the player wants to bet. We say except if they're not providing an integer, and then we do a quick little check that even if they did provide an integer, we want to make sure that the bet is not greater than the chips total. And if that's the case, we'll print out a little message telling them how much they have left. Else, if that's okay and there's an integer there, we'll just break out of this while true loop, and we've set chips.bet successfully. So let's run this and now move on to step 7, which is to write a function for taking hits. This one's actually pretty straightforward. All we need to do here is say hand, and we're going to add a card to the hand from the actual deck. You could do this all in one line, or you could separate it out into 2 lines, saying something like single card is equal to deck deal, and then add in to that hand the single card you just defined, and we want to make sure that we adjust for the ace afterward. So we can say hand adjust for ace, and we'll call that method as well. All right, so now we have hit. It takes the deck and someone's hand, grabs a single card from the deck, adds it to the hand, and then checks for an ace adjustment. Step 8 is to write a function prompting the player to hit or stand. So this function, what it's going to do is going to accept the deck and the player's hand as arguments and assign playing as a global variable. And this is actually to control an upcoming while loop. You could just provide playing here in the function as well and then return it back. It's kind of up to you how you want to deal with it. But this is just going to be another while true loop, very similar to before. We will say x is equal to input, asking hit or stand, enter h or s. And then we'll say if x lowercase is equal to h. So why am I doing this? Well, maybe someone is going to misunderstand this line and then type out something like hit or something like hh. Maybe they do lowercase stand. In that case, what I'm going to do is be able to grab the string, grab the first letter of it, lowercase, and say if it equals h, they probably meant to hit. So I'm going to say hit from the deck on their hand, else if x0 dot lowercase is equal to s. I'm going to assume they want it to stand. Now I'm going to say print player stands, dealer's turn. And I'll set playing equal to false. And this is because I'm going to use this in a while loop later on. You didn't have to do it this way. Again, there's many different ways you can control the while loop later on. This is just the way we're going to do it so that we can kind of clearly see it in the while loop later on. Finally, we'll have an else statement that says print, sorry, I did not understand that. Please enter H or S only. Because that basically means they didn't enter something that starts with an H or an S. Then I'm going to continue. And if none of those gets triggered, then what happens is we just go ahead and break. Okay, the next thing we want to do is write functions to handle each of the game situations where it's going to end. And remember to pass in the player's hand, the dealer's hand, and the chips as needed. So let's go ahead and pass those in. We'll say pass in the player, who's represented by a hand. Let's make sure we spell that right. Pass in the dealer, who's represented by a hand object, and then pass in the chips themselves. We'll grab these and pass them into all of them, except for push, because if there's a push, that means both player and dealer got 21, so we won't actually do anything with the chips. So here on push, that's the easiest one. We don't really do anything. We just say dealer and player tie, push. For the other ones, we're basically going to print a message out and then adjust the chips themselves. So if the player bus, we'll print out bust player. We'll take those chips and then we'll call the lose bet method off of them. Player wins, very similar thing. We print out player wins. We take those chips and then we say win bet. If the dealer bus, it's going to be the same thing up here. The player will win the dealer bus, except we'll add another message here. Player wins, dealer busted. If the dealer wins, it's going to be a similar thing to the player busting, except the message will be different. They'll still lose their bet, except we'll say dealer wins. Okay, run that cell. And now, the last thing we need to do is actually run the logic of the game. We'll be doing that in the next lecture, but let's quickly review what we did in this lecture. So we started off by creating the actual functions that we're going to be calling in the next lecture. We first started off with take bet, which is just in some form or manner getting an input from the user and then setting it to the current bet. Lots of different ways you could do this. Then we wanted to write a function for taking hits. So we take in the deck, we take in a hand, we take in a single card from the deck, add it to the hand, and then adjust the hand for an ace. Then we wanted to write a function prompting the player to hit or stand. Basically, we just wanted to figure out, hey, am I going to call hit, or am I going to just stand and say that this current player is no longer playing? Or I can just continue if they didn't provide an H or an S. Then I wanted to write functions to display the cards. Lots of different ways you can do this. You can check out the notebook for some more advanced one-liner ways of displaying all of this information. And then we wanted to write functions to handle each of the game situations where we basically either call lose bet or win bet and print out a message. Coming up next, we're going to code out the logic for the entire game.